Here is a fact that should stop you cold. 4,000 years ago, an Egyptian physician sat down and wrote a description of a patient. He described someone who had stopped eating, someone who could not sleep, someone who moved through their days as if the air itself had become too heavy to push through, someone whose mind was dark, as if a curtain had been drawn across the inside of their skull. That physician was not describing something new. He was not writing about a condition he had only recently encountered. He was documenting something that had already been happening to human beings for as long as anyone could remember. What he was describing was depression. And here is what nobody tells you. Depression is not a modern disease. Anxiety is not a product of your phone or your inbox or the noise of the 21st century. These are not conditions we invented. They are not side effects of a civilization gone wrong. They are as old as the human brain itself. And the story of how ancient people understood them, treated them, and sometimes got terrifyingly close to the truth without any of our modern tools, that story is one of the most overlooked chapters in all of human history. So let's go back. All the way back. We need to start in ancient Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq. Roughly 4,000 years ago, in the cities of Babylon and Assyria, there were physicians. Not doctors the way we understand doctors today, but trained practitioners who observed patients, recorded symptoms, and attempted treatment. And among the conditions they recorded with remarkable consistency were things that look, when you read the ancient clay tablet descriptions today, almost exactly like what we would now call generalized anxiety disorder, obsessive behavior, and depression. But here is where it gets interesting. The Mesopotamians did not think of these as illnesses of the mind. They had no concept of mental illness as we understand it. Instead, they had a framework that made complete sense within their worldview. Mental suffering was the work of gods and demons. Specific gods with specific names were responsible for specific conditions. In Mesopotamian medical texts, mental illnesses were literally called hands: the hand of Ishtar, the hand of Shamash, the hand of the ghost. Each name represented a different condition caused by a different divine force taking hold of a person. The word hand was not metaphorical. They genuinely believed that a supernatural being had reached into the sufferer and was gripping them from the inside. Now, you might be tempted to dismiss that as pure superstition, but think about it from their perspective. You have a person who cannot eat, cannot sleep, cannot function, is consumed by terror that has no visible source, is trapped in spiraling thoughts they cannot escape, and there is nothing physically wrong with them. No wound, no fever, no broken bone. In a world without neuroscience, without any understanding of brain chemistry, what explanation would you reach for? Something invisible is doing this, something powerful, something that does not answer to ordinary medicine. They were not wrong that something invisible was doing it. They were just wrong about what that something was, and they treated it accordingly. Mesopotamian treatment for mental illness involved priests, incantations, rituals, and the sacrifice of animals to appease whichever deity had taken hold of the patient. One documented treatment for depression involved a ritual ceremony between two small figurines, followed by the sacrifice of a sheep. The logic was that the ritual would satisfy the offended god and persuade them to release their grip. Does that sound absurd? Maybe, but they were observing real symptoms, taking them seriously as a medical matter, creating documented treatment protocols, and following up on outcomes. That is more than many cultures managed for centuries after them. Now let's go to Egypt. Around 1550 BC, an unknown Egyptian physician compiled what became one of the most important medical documents in human history. We call it the Ebers Papyrus. It is long, detailed, serious. It covers over 500 different medical conditions with descriptions of symptoms, causes, and treatments. And in its pages is something extraordinary. There is a section that describes a condition with symptoms so specific, so carefully observed, so clinically precise that modern psychiatrists reading it today recognize it immediately. The ancient Egyptian physician described a patient whose mind kneels, whose heart becomes weary, who eats little and is difficult, whose mind is like one who is thinking of something else, disconnected, absent, there but not there. And then the line that stops every scholar who reads it cold. His mind is dark. That is 4,000-year-old clinical documentation of depression. The Egyptians saw it, they named it, they wrote it down with the same careful attention they gave to fevers and infections and wounds. And crucially, they located it not in the head, but in the heart, because in Egyptian thought, the heart was the seat of all emotion, memory, and will. The heart was not just a pump, it was the center of the self. And when the self broke down, the Egyptians looked to the heart first. They were wrong about the location, but they were right about almost everything else. The Egyptian treatment for this condition of darkness included rest, music, travel, actually changing the patient's physical environment to break the cycle of their suffering, and the use of fragrant herbs and incantations to drive away whatever force had caused the darkness. Some of that sounds mystical, but rest and environmental change, those are things we still recommend today. Here is the part of the story I want you to sit with for a moment, because this is where it stops being just history and starts being something deeper.
In Mesopotamia, they said mental suffering was the hand of a god pressing down on you from outside. In Egypt, they said it was a darkness inside the heart. In ancient China, texts from 3,000 years ago described what they called an imbalance between yin and yang, a disruption in the natural flow of forces that should move smoothly through a healthy person. When the flow was blocked, when the balance was broken, the result was confusion, mania, grief without cause, fear without source. In ancient India, Ayurvedic texts from roughly the same period described mental illness as a disruption of the three doshas, three fundamental energies that governed all physical and mental life. An excess of one energy over another could produce states of extreme emotion, disconnection from reality, inability to function. Different cultures, different languages, different cosmologies, different words, but the same observation underneath all of them. Something inside a person could fall out of balance, and when it did, the person suffered in ways that had no physical explanation. And that suffering was real, was serious, and deserved treatment. Every ancient civilization that left records independently concluded the same thing. Mental suffering is not weakness, it is not moral failure, it is a condition. It has causes, it has symptoms, and it requires care. Now we need to talk about the most extreme treatment in this entire story, because nothing captures the desperation of ancient attempts to treat mental illness quite like trepanation. Trepanation, the practice of drilling a hole into a living person's skull. This is the oldest surgical procedure for which we have archaeological evidence anywhere on Earth. The earliest confirmed examples date to around 6500 BC, that is 8,500 years ago, and at a single burial site in France, archaeologists found that 40 out of 120 prehistoric skulls showed evidence of trepanation. Not a few, 40. And here's the detail that should hit you harder than the surgery itself. Many of those skulls showed bone regrowth around the holes, which means the patients survived. They lived for years, sometimes decades, after someone scraped or drilled or cut a hole in their head in 6500 BC with stone tools. The logic behind trepanation was the same logic that ran through virtually all ancient thinking about mental illness. If something invisible has gotten inside a person and is causing their suffering, then you create an exit. You open the skull and give whatever is inside a way out. It is the most literal possible interpretation of the belief that mental illness is caused by something that has invaded from outside. Something got in, so you open a door and you let it leave. From a modern standpoint, that is not how any of this works. Schizophrenia is not a demon that exits through a hole in the skull. Depression is not a spirit that can be surgically removed. But the fact that this procedure was performed across Europe, across Asia, across the Americas, across Africa, in cultures that had no contact with each other, tells you something important. Mental illness was everywhere. It has always been everywhere. And everywhere people saw it, they tried everything they could think of to treat it. That is not ignorance. That is human urgency. The urgency of watching someone you love disappear inside themselves and refusing to accept that there is nothing to be done. The real turning point came from ancient Greece, specifically from a physician born around 460 BC on the island of Kos, a man you have heard of even if you have never read a word he wrote, Hippocrates. Hippocrates proposed something genuinely revolutionary, something that cut against thousands of years of established thinking. He proposed that mental illness was not spiritual, it was physical. It was a condition of the body, specifically of the brain, and it had natural causes that could be understood and treated through natural means. He proposed a theory of 4 bodily fluids whose balance determined both physical and mental health. An excess of one fluid, which he called black bile, produced the condition he named with words that survived directly into modern English. He called it dark, heavy, hopeless, slowed down state of depression, melancholia, from the Greek words for black and bile, black bile. The excess of it was what made a person heavy and dark and unable to feel joy. He was wrong about black bile, obviously, but the framework underneath the theory was correct. Mental illness is a physical condition. It is a product of something going wrong in the body. It responds to physical treatment, and it is not the patient's fault, not a divine punishment, not a sign of spiritual failure. That idea seems obvious to us now, but it was radical in 460 BC. It took genuine intellectual courage to propose it. Hippocrates also documented specific conditions with a clinical precision that still impresses historians. He described what we would recognize as postpartum depression. He described episodes of extreme mania followed by collapse into despair, what we would now call bipolar disorder. He described states of irrational terror, what we would now call panic disorder. He saw all of it, he named all of it, and he argued against the prevailing wisdom of his entire civilization that none of it was supernatural. Then the Middle Ages arrived in Europe, and with them came a return to the supernatural framework. Mental illness was once again the work of demons. The physicians needed priests, not physicians. The intellectually sophisticated medical traditions of Greece and Rome were largely set aside, and the people who suffered from what Hippocrates had clearly identified as medical conditions were treated as spiritual threats rather than sick human beings. This is the uncomfortable part of the history, because it shows you that understanding does not only move forward. Ancient Egyptians treating depression with music and rest were more scientifically sophisticated in some respects than medieval Europeans burning herbs to drive out demons. Knowledge is not automatically passed down. Progress is not automatic. Every generation has to choose whether to build on what came before or to decide it already knows better. Here's what I want you to take away from all of this. The next time someone tells you that anxiety is a modern problem caused by social media or the pace of modern life, you can tell them about the Mesopotamian clay tablets, 4,000 years old, documenting the hand of a god pressing down on a person who cannot sleep, cannot eat, cannot stop the spiral of their own thoughts. The next time someone implies that depression is weakness or a choice or something a person could simply decide their way out of, you can tell them about the Egyptian physician who 4,000 years ago wrote that a patient's mind was dark, who took it seriously enough to write it down, who understood that what he was seeing was real, was medical, and required care. The next time anyone dismisses mental illness as something soft, something invented by modern people who have it too easy, you can tell them about the skulls with holes in them, 8,500 years ago, bone grown back around the edges, patients and survived, because someone loved them enough to try. Mental illness is not new. It has never been new. It is as old as the human brain, as old as the first person who looked out at a world that should have been fine and felt for reasons they could not name that it was not. Every culture that has ever existed has grappled with this. Every civilization has tried to answer the same question. Why do some people suffer in ways that leave no physical mark? And what, if anything, can we do about it? We are still answering that question. We have better tools now than the Mesopotamians did. We understand brain chemistry in ways Hippocrates could not have imagined. We have medications and therapies that would look like pure magic to an Egyptian physician in 1550 BC. But the question itself is ancient, and the suffering underneath it is ancient. And the human impulse to take that suffering seriously, to look it in the face and say, this is real and it deserves care, that impulse goes back further than writing, further than cities, further than civilization. It goes back to the very beginning of us. And the fact that you are here, listening to this, means that impulse is still alive. 4,000 years ago, a physician picked up a reed and wrote that someone's mind was dark. You are still listening to what he had to say.